So the second body system we will look at is the respiratory system, and it's just solely looking at the acute responses to exercise, which is anything that happens as an immediate consequence of a work bout or straight after. So that first key knowledge point is the same as the cardiovascular. We're looking at mechanisms responsible, so what happens to make things change. But we also need to talk about a few other things, and that's oxygen uptake at rest, during exercise and recovery, and also the terms oxygen deficit, steady state, and EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption.
Guiding questions are again provided to help you structure some responses and notes from the particular PowerPoint, always supported by the text and now the web links that make sense. So you're encouraged to write these down, annotate as you would per an exam, and then to flesh out the details here and where you come up with blanks or problems or confusions. That's when you start the conversation with fellow students and myself.
Pretty simple, essential question. What happens to our respiratory system when we exercise? Now, unlike the cardiovascular system where a few things go down and one or two things stay the same, everything in the respiratory system goes up, so increases in each of those 5 variables. Respiration rate, simply the number of breaths we take per minute. The mechanism responsible is located in our brain, and it's basically called like the respiratory center. So our brain detects high levels of carbon dioxide and increases our respiration rate in response. So at rest, typically around 10 to 12, that can go all the way up to 50 if you're working maximally. Total volume is the other key parameter here, and that's just the amount of air we breathe in and out per breath. It's about half a litre at rest, can get up to 5 litres when we're working. So total volume and respiratory rate are the equivalent in the cardiovascular system of beats per minute and stroke volume. Together, respiratory rate times total volume equals ventilation or minute ventilation. There's a number of letter abbreviations. Simply V will work as well, but here we've got VE, sometimes it's MV for minute ventilation. So the amount of air inspired or expired per minute by the lungs. And at rest, we ventilate approximately 6 litres per minute, which would be 500 mils total volume times 12 breaths per minute. It can go up to almost 200 litres per minute there for probably a very trained athlete working maximally. Just important to remember that when we're talking about respiratory rate, total volume and ventilation, we're talking about air. Don't get confused with oxygen. That's a component of air. And here's just some basic respiratory volumes. Look, you wouldn't be expected to know the ins and outs of these, but I don't think it hurts to know some basic numbers, particularly I can remember at rest quite easily. Thereafter, I get a little bit lost. But if you can remember 500 mils times 12 breaths equals 6 litres, that'd be pretty useful to remember. You certainly could be asked something like this from a multiple choice question. Another graph here is to have a bit of a look at. This time it just says pulmonary ventilation. Essentially means the same thing. Remember, pulmonary indicates the lungs. Because the unit here is in litres per minute, it's really just ventilation. They've just added a bit more jargon for you. So interestingly, this has got negative numbers on the bottom axis. So rest before we start is minus numbers. Then it starts to increase according to intensity from low, moderate to high, but in every one of those cases the athlete reaches a steady state where the oxygen consumption plateaus, and then there's a recovery period after exercise. In looking at diffusion, it's as simple as remembering that things move from areas of high concentration or high pressure to areas of low concentration or low pressure. In this case, we'll just talk about concentration. And within the lungs, obviously, we've got blood returning to the lungs with a relatively high level concentration of carbon dioxide and a relatively low level of oxygen. And then we take a big breath in, and those proportions change such that the big breath has higher levels of oxygen and lower levels of carbon dioxide. So we get a gaseous exchange occurring across the capillaries in the alveoli. Just remember that pulmonary means lungs, so if you're talking about pulmonary diffusion, you must be talking about the alveoli and the capillaries, not the skeletal muscle, even though the process is the same. So oxygen uptake is the volume of oxygen transported to, taken up and utilised by the body. When we get that to maximal levels, then that's VO2 max, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about that. Now, this can be also discussed in terms of METs. And MET is simply a unit, and we'll be able to measure this when we're at Exercise Research Australia doing our lab. But you can actually measure these units called METs which will eventually work up to a number that equals your VO2 max. If you are an incredibly fit athlete with a VO2 max of 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute, you are consuming 20 METs worth of oxygen. Here's another graph, pretty funky looking graph. Looks like 4 kind of slightly smoked cigarettes from where I'm looking at. But oxygen uptake increases in the lungs in a linear relationship with increases to intensity. So here we've got exercise at speed from 11 kilometers up to 16 kilometers, and we've got oxygen uptake on the left-hand side, and that just goes up in a straight line at a 45-degree angle. We'll call that in a linear fashion. There are 3 terms we're now going to start to pull apart that help to explain levels of oxygen consumption in response to exercise. And we're going to start with the middle one because it's the easiest. Steady state, as the name suggests, is where we are working comfortably, where the body is taking in sufficient oxygen to be able to work, and that everything is just going along smooth and steady, where oxygen consumption is plateauing. So any period of oxygen consumption on a graph that is horizontal or flat-lined, we are said to be in steady state. So oxygen deficit is perhaps the most abstract of the 3 terms we'll talk about, because it talks about a volume of oxygen that we can't actually see. Now, it occurs in lots and lots of sporting scenarios, particularly at the start of an event, as the body takes time to get the aerobic energy system up and running. There's a shortfall in oxygen supply, so we do not meet the demand. The red lines on this particular graph indicate periods of oxygen deficit. So every little peak or every little climb at those grades, when somebody's doing a run at a higher intensity or a steeper incline, there is a shortfall of oxygen, an oxygen deficit, and we indicate what we'd like to get by drawing that red line up to where we get the next steady state. So it doesn't physically exist as oxygen consumed, it indicates what we would have liked to have had, but were unable to use. The third term we're going to play with is EPOC. Now, if you can remember what it actually stands for, it should make it very easy to discuss. So, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. In some of the graphs to follow and some of the text you'll see, it used to be called oxygen debt, which actually indicates something being repaid. But it's better to think about, due to exercise periods of oxygen deficit, we need to restore the oxygen that's being used during those periods of time. So there's a massive restoration process going on with EPOC, but especially concerning restoring the muscle and the blood with oxygen so that it can go again. So here are the 3 terms in a graph that you'll see over and over again. Starting again in the middle where it's easiest, when there's a flat horizontal line in an oxygen consumption graph, we've got steady state. So oxygen supply equals demand. The period immediately left of that, where the oxygen consumption goes up in a steep curve, and then the hypothetical dotted line suggesting the amount of oxygen we would have liked indicates oxygen deficit, or the shortfall in oxygen we would have loved to have had, but there was not enough supply to meet our demand. Then the area right of the graph, once the exercise bout is finished, is EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and that goes down to the resting level of oxygen consumption and shows the volume of oxygen we consume after exercise greater than we did before we started to work. So these 2 graphs here, and a keen eye will notice that the green section of the graph refers to oxygen debt, which is the old term for EPOC. We now call it EPOC. But if you look at the 2 differences here, we've got a light to moderate exercise at the top and then a heavy exercise at the bottom. You should hopefully be able to pull apart what happens with steady state, periods of oxygen deficit, and EPOC to the right-hand side to compare the nature of exercise and what impact it has on those 3 components. So here's the mind map for this slideshow that I've put together, and there's the 5 acute respiratory responses on the left-hand side, and for me they follow a far more logical order than the cardiovascular, which tended to go around in a loop or a circle. And then on the right-hand side, there's 3 terms that we were playing with: oxygen deficit, steady state, and EPOC, and just trying to explain those a bit more fully. So they're the 2 aspects of this slideshow. It'd be great for you to put together your own mind map. For this bonus task, I want you to have a look at the idea of running economy. Now, I don't actually have speed on this graph, but let's just assume at 4 minutes, so let's read off the bottom level for both graphs. At 4 minutes, the two different subjects, so the top graph and the bottom graph are two different subjects, they're running at the same speed. Can you talk to me about running economy using the data from the 4-minute time point? Who do you think would be the more efficient aerobic athlete and why?